We'll now move on to the third party. Mr. Rodney, will you be combining your time with the Minister?
Yes, please.
Okay, you have a total of 20 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to Minister, staff, and hi to everyone, including all of our Indigenous friends who might be watching right now or might hear about this at a future date. I believe that we're around this table for the same reason. And I once again, I say thank you and hi. Minister, I feel the moral obligation to jump right into a scourge in our society right now, and that's fentanyl and opioids. As you know very well, I've asked on a number of occasions in question period questions of you, and because it goes across the board to Health Minister, Justice Minister, Premier, I've asked questions there as well. Mm-hmm. As you know better than many, absolutely terrible things are happening out there. But as I pointed out in some of my questions, that there are some amazing things that have happened, including on certain First Nations communities and with certain individuals that are, some of the best practices that I might have hoped had been transferred to other places. So my questions are regarding estimates indeed, but related to this topic. Minister, do you have enough money in your budget to combat this crisis in extremely effective ways? And what exactly is happening with that money?
Well, I think that your point that this is a serious crisis and one that needs to be dealt with is quite appropriate in that we have people dying, and that's something that we don't want to have happen. You will be aware, of course, though, that that the actual responses to the opioid crisis are largely not held within my ministry, because we don't have the people on the ground that are there. In the health clinic, of course, all of those staff people are in the health department. And in the police and other emergency groups who, for example, carry naloxone kits with them, again, are not employees of my department. Mm-hmm. They're employees of other ministries. And so what you'll find is that the large part of the response to this problem is going to be found in ministries other than our particular ministry. Our ministry is working much more in terms of the relational piece that connects each of the reserves that comes forward and has concerns about things to the ministries that are appropriate to deal with these issues. And so you'll see that what we have done is we have made sure that we have increased the amount of resources that we have in the ministerial office to enhance that communication between our ministry and the other ministries, because that's our role. It's the coordination role. It's the articulation of the needs of the community's role. And
I'm glad to hear you say that, Minister. Believe me, I don't expect you to answer on behalf of other ministers, but you hit the nail on the head. That correlation absolutely must happen, because it is a matter of life and death, and along those lines, in ways that neither you nor I, and I don't know, I can't speak for anybody else that's here today, but can feel some of the pain that occurs. And this didn't happen on reserve, but I would encourage everyone to read Chris Nelson's article from the Calgary Herald today, because I think it does explain how difficult it is. It's really harsh, folks, including not only the title, but what it says in there. And but I know, Chair, we must refer to numbers, and so just right at the end, Chris refers to the fact that when it comes to fighting opioid abuse, we're told that Alberta will spend up to $56 million this year. And he goes on. I'm just going to read what it says, because this is how Albertans are feeling. Yet, when battling climate change by cutting carbon emissions through free light bulbs and the like, we'll spend 10 times that, $566 million, in the next 3 years. Theoretically, saving the planet is much nicer than saving actual Albertans, and in that regard, you can't keep Notley quiet about her wondrous social license. Now, this is just his. So again, the question was, though, between you and the other departments, do you have what you need to do what needs to be done to fend off this scourge?
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear such a cynical view of working with.
He has reason. It affected his family personally in the deepest way.
I agree. I think that It's something that we will touch on every Albertan. It's not just an Indigenous issue, and I think I want to make that very clear. Fentanyl is not particularly worse in the Indigenous community.
Right?
I'm sorry?
They have particular needs.
They do.
Things are different.
And that's why we have a role to participate in terms of how does this play out in the Indigenous community. But the fact that we have to deal with the fentanyl crisis is indeed an all-government issue. We have every ministry looking at their role in participating in that. And you can say we only have a small amount of money set for fentanyl, but that's really not true, because we've designed massive systems that are all part of that. Our whole policing system, our whole healthcare system are all designed to help people in crisis. It happens to be fentanyl today. A few years back, it was a different drug.
It was crystal meth back when I was the chair of ADAC, but this is a killer in a different way, and there's more.
And the next one coming down the pipe is going to be even worse than that, I think.
10 or 100, there's different versions coming out. And so Mr. Chair, I really want to support and encourage not only the minister, but the Premier and the other ministers and ministries and the people who work with them to, it's one thing to dedicate money, but it's the action, and people are dying by the day, and we just want that.
But it's also why we need to ensure that we have a medical system that is there and readily available, that isn't directed just toward resolving the issue of fentanyl, because it has to be, we put all this money into the revamp of the emergency at the Misericordia Hospital, $55 million. And the reason why is because you need to have those concrete structural responses to these kind of issues.
We do need both.
Not just a one-off when a crisis happens to occur with a particular
but
drug.
Specifically referring to our Indigenous Albertans, I would like to flip it on its head, because we can't ever forget this until it's done, and there is going to be something next we'll have to deal with as well. But I know in my time in cabinet, in wellness, touring around the province, I made sure I visited as many Indigenous communities and individuals as I could.
Good.
And I learned a great deal, and I found out there were a lot of wonderful things happening in terms of wellness. That was then. And could you just give us an update? What is your ministry doing now to encourage wellness programs that are occurring on First Nations reserve, for instance, and not what's happening, but on a go-forward basis? Because let's face it, there's so many different cultures out there, and so many. There's a wealth of ideas. Are they being cultivated, and what's being implemented? What's happening with money in wellness?
Well, I have two ways to give you answers, really, because I have some very particular things I can talk about. I can simply talk about having provided $100 million for water on reserves, because that's a fundamental health issue. And so I can talk about that. I can also talk about things like the Fort Chip Human Health and Cancer Action Plan, where we're doing a full evaluation as asked for by the community for many years, and they never got that previously. So we have this plan to lay out what do we understand about the cancer in the area and the rates, and how are they increasing or not, because there's been dispute, as you know, over the number of years.
Of course, but Minister, if I can just jump in, I hear you and I applaud that, but this often begs the question, the difference between health and wellness. Of course, they're connected, but what do you have that's not after the fact, as in the case of cancer, but things that keep people happy, healthy, out of the hospital, about healthy eating, active living, that are positive, proactive, and preventative, that increase quality of life while decreasing healthcare costs and taxes. So on the front end.
Which is why I mentioned water. Which is why I
but what
mentioned
else?
In my speech.
If there's good news stories, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, $120 million for off-reserve housing. Housing is a fundamental relationship with wellness and with subsequent disease and so on. We know that. And we've just had a big increase there. A lot of our climate leadership money is going to improving housing on reserves by providing opportunities for ensuring better windows and doors and all of those kind of things. So we have actually multiple areas in which we've done things. The other thing I think is really important for us to talk about is the fact that through our signing protocol agreements, we have also established a process by which that every treaty organization can sit down with the health ministers and with the other ministers, whether it be housing or seniors or even culture, to talk about the kinds of things that are being done to improve wellness in the community. So we've actually changed the underlying structure to ensure those conversations aren't just one-off. It's just not, whether Richard shows up at the community and happens to have a community visit.
Right.
They have a table where they're professionals are meeting on a regular basis, the technicians, and then they bring the political level people to set direction, and that will be ongoing, long-lasting beyond our
I've
government.
said for years, and perhaps you'd agree, Minister, it's intergenerational, it's intercultural, it's across the board. It's going to take a long time. I'm hoping that we keep moving this in the right direction. And you mentioned, Minister, about renewed relationship, and as you know, I'm just a huge fan. It's the only way that's ever made any kind of sense to me. But something went off the rails recently with the situation with the Tsutina and the Springbank dam. It's a mess. I mean, even just yesterday, the comments from the mayor of Calgary, with all great respect, muddied the water, if you'll pardon the pun. Could you clarify, just from your perspective, just for the record, what was the nature, because consultations, and that's part of your ministry and the estimates, what has happened with respect to Springbank Dam in terms of consultations, and so that's looking back, but also in the future, what are your short, medium, and long-term goals with that? Because we've got to do the right thing there.
Well, there are a couple of things I think I need to address, and some I can't, because it obviously is being dealt with primarily from the Ministry of Transportation, their responsibility. But one of the things I think is really important is that you characterize it as having gone off the rails, and I would say that's a mischaracterization. When we talk about having a renewed relationship with the communities, there's no pretense that somehow this is all going to be sunshine and roses. A real relationship sometimes is very rocky, but that's a sign of a healthy relationship. If I was working with a marital couple, I wouldn't say, if you never talk to each other and never have a disagreement, then you're happy. That would be a silly thing to say at a marital couple. So when I talk about the relationship, the renewed relationship we have with First Nations, we don't anticipate that they won't disagree with us. We won't anticipate that they won't come forward and advocate for things that are important to them in terms of we don't want you to put the Springbank in one particular place because we're worried about how it's going to affect part of our community, and particularly houses that we intend to build and so on. Of course we anticipate them coming forward. In fact, we know we have a successful relationship because they are in the place of being able to say they have opinions, and they know that we're going to respond to those. They're being bold, they're being out front, and we are responding to all of that.
But have you met with the chief, and will you meet with the chief again?
Absolutely, we have met. I have met with the chief. The minister responsible has met with the chief on multiple occasions. Indeed, just last week, we were both in Calgary. I'm sorry?
Have you met with the new chief?
With the new, yes.
Okay,
Lee
good.
and I have had a conversation just, I think about a month ago he came to Edmonton. Okay. And just last week in Calgary, I was down there at McDougall House, and so was Minister Mason. And Minister Mason was meeting with Chief Crowchild, and then we met together afterwards to have a conversation so that we were up to date.
And that goes perfectly with your business plan, which is to advise other Government of Alberta ministries on Indigenous issues and policies. And don't get me wrong, Mr. Chair, I'm encouraging you and asking, Tsutina is my next door neighbor to Calgary Lougheed, and we need to do right, not just by all Albertans, Tsutina, Calgary, and the rest of the province too. So, but I know that you strive for a renewed relationship with Indigenous Albertans, and before your time, I suggested to the previous minister that they change the name to Indigenous Relations for a whole lot of reasons, and I appreciate that they did take that advice. But a couple of questions about this. And again, I'm not knocking it, because I know how this works. You can't just jump in and act. Things need to be talked about and decided upon first. But the stage that it's at, I've heard it described this way, and it was written down for me. It's a certain set of agreements to develop some kind of platform to decide on how to plan in the future. And again, I'm not making fun, but I guess what kind of a timeline do we have going forward in terms of actual? Because, Mr. Hansen, who had one of the same questions about the apology that could happen someday. I'll ask this question, so that would be a preamble. What are some tangible examples of various ministries' progress on developing and implementing programs and policies and practices that support the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other ministries?
Yeah, I know.
If we can point at specific things that actually have happened, either last year, Mr. Chair, or this coming year? What are the intentions?
Well, I think there are many things that I can speak to. I'll just start picking a few and going through them. For example, in education, the Ministry of Education, they have committed to a renewal of the curriculum across this province, grades 1 to grade 12, over a period of years. And one of the pillars of that renewal is the inclusion of First Nations history, culture, and both before settler contact and subsequently. And that includes issues of oppression, such as the residential schools, such as the 60 Scoop, and other issues, and racism. All of that, in its bare truth, will be included in the curriculum at appropriate developmental levels and grades. And that's something that's never happened before in this province. So that's the very first time, and that's a reflection of the United Nations Declaration. We've signed agreements, for example, with the Kataskanau Tribal Council to provide wraparound services. Again, another one of these situations where, for in the past, so much the education on reserves has been viewed as being a federal jurisdictional issue, and we have stepped forward and said, look, these people live in Alberta. These people are Albertans, although they don't like to have that defined in a way that excludes their treaty rights of being an independent nation.
Agreed and understood.
And I agree with that.
Yeah.
But so I'm just being cautious. But we've signed an agreement to step in, to provide all kinds of wraparound services to Kataskanau. And now that's been the model for discussions in a variety of other places. For example, we're very close to an MOU with the Musqueam bands around education. So we've done that. We've included Indigenous language programming now for kindergarten to grade 12. That'll include both language and culture. We have the Alberta Indigenous internship program that allows 32 intern positions next year, an increase from the 9 of last year that we're bringing people in. We have, for example, changed the regulations regarding non-resident fees for public libraries that required people to pay in order to go into a library if they were a non-resident. And we've changed that so that everyone living on reserve can now go into a public library in this province without paying a fee, and making that accessible.
Those are great stories, Minister. And I just wonder if it's possible, we don't need a written or verbal commitment, but what are your thoughts on perhaps updating the legislature quarterly or every 6 months or every year on the success rate? Because, I mean, as you might recall, what is there, 46 sets of recommendations for UNDRIP, and could you maybe share with all Albertans via the legislature gains that are made, because that's a lot. And
we do. I mean, and literally, I can tell you, I have a list of the things that are reflections of the United Nations Declaration that took 8 pages for us to type out. If I look particularly across ministries, because that we have made the commitment that this is an all-government response. It isn't just about the Minister of Indigenous Relations changing his relationship. It's about every single ministry asking themselves the question, as we begin to do this piece of work that we're doing, how do we understand the relationship with the First Nations and whether it's going to influence or affect them in any way?
And I think most people would understand it's interministerial. In fact, some would argue it's completely across the board.
Well, that is absolutely the intention. And I think we have literally dozens and dozens of big successes, and some of them with serious money, like $100 million for water. Some of them smaller, like the libraries, for example. And that was only just one small section I read to you. I could go through all the rest.
I'd love if we could have that in writing later. I'd be happy to share that with folks.
In the ministerial annual report, we will start to focus more carefully on those kind of things, articulating not only my own ministry, but all of the other ministries' successes in this area.
I encourage that. And, you've heard me say way too many times, stop blaming and start governing. This has nothing to do with any of that. In that UNDRIP and TRC and the other fentanyl, they're new. So they are in your lap now and want to support you. But speaking of TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, and as you know, there are many. Can you give us, either now or in written form, Mr. Chair, later, tangible examples of your and other ministries' progress on developing and implementing programs, policies, and practices that support the TRC recommendations, and what specific acts of reconciliation will you embark upon in this upcoming year related to these estimates? Well,
as you know, we've already done many things, starting right away with the request or the apology for the residential schools that was made by Premier Notley, one of our very first acts as government, and proceeded.
I pushed for that the week before. You remember that?
I'm sorry?
I pushed for it the week before, saying there wasn't anything
I'm sure. I welcome you to keep our toes to the fire on these things. Reconciliation.
Well, we work together on these things.
Exactly. I think reconciliation has to be the keystone of our relationship moving forward. And the TRC is a fabulous doc.
We'll have to
Thank
pick
you
up.
very
Is that a
much,
stop or
Minister. Please go ahead, Mr. Rodney.
Thank you so much. And as the chair may know, a couple of sessions ago, I used the time that was remaining just to ask some questions, read them into the record, and they were indeed answered, and I appreciate the previous minister did that. So I'll just read them into the record now. What are the tangible examples of various ministries' commitment to and progress on the national inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls? Question 2, how many more children have received services under Jordan's principle in 2016 than in the previous year, and what's the status of ensuring that children receive the same high quality of care on reserve as off reserve? What have been the impacts of the Daniels decision on your ministry's work last year, and what do you expect going forward? Last year, you speculated about putting money into First Nations for health, and as we discussed, hopefully wellness. That was from Hansard, by the way, page RS 279. Just wondering if that indeed did happen and what the results were. How many more Indigenous students are there in Alberta's post-secondary education system this year compared to last year? How many more faculty? And is Athabasca University adequately supported? Because, of course, many of our Indigenous students attend, both from Alberta and Canada. Key Strategy 1.5 included supporting the development of a consolidated Government of Alberta report on Indigenous statistics. And, of course, we're living in an age where we need to measure it in order to get support often, and that's difficult. But what's the progress on that, and what performance measures or indicators in the business plan or other ministries' business plans reflect information drawn from that statistical resource? And speaking of performance measures, the performance measurement framework, this is from Hansard RS 285. You mentioned that your department was working to improve that, but it doesn't appear that there's any new performance measures or indicators in your business plan for this year. So just wondering what happened to that new performance measurement framework. Will the public get to see that? Will you report publicly on progress and ability to hit performance measures? And what's the strategy to ensure that you do hit those performance measures? Because again, this is coming from a place of if we can measure it, if we can prove it, then we can not only put the money towards it, but the action to make things better with and for our Indigenous Albertans. Now, a couple questions on legislation. Just wondering what happened to last year's Bill 22, for those who don't remember, an act to provide for the repatriation of Indigenous peoples' sacred ceremonial objects, and what department and community resources were spent on the bill that failed, and what policies and practices have been developed to address the problems or needs that Bill 22 was intended to address before it died on the order paper, and wondering who asked for the bill to not be debated. Next question's on the Aboriginal Consultation Levy Act, wondering what the status for replacement of that is. There's so much more. I care so much. I wish we had more time.
Thank you very much.